Okay. So this is crazy. It gets now. We need a crazy drum roll now. It gets completely crazy now. Okay. Whoa, we are happening now. We are happening now. And Rob, don't feel bad, Rob, that while you're going to the bathroom, you missed the most important piece. Don't feel bad about that. It's okay. It's okay. All right, here we go. Okay, so what's our problem here? What's our problem? All right, so we got a problem. We got a very, very big problem that we need to solve. And I'm going to try and do it in kind of very, very short order, but it's a huge problem. And the solution to it is so fucking gorgeous that it just blows your mind. It's really subtle. It's fine wine. Okay? So again, I get it if you're into cheap beer. So I don't want to feel bad about it. So all the cheap beer people, just go to sleep now. We're going for like super high class, refined, grapes, 1831, Provence, right? Right, so that's what we're doing. But again, I totally get if that, oh no, okay, we'll do it. Okay, here we go. Okay, ready? So here we go. So here's the problem. And Howard basically makes this argument in his book, The Lucifer Principle, before we met. He makes an argument, a very powerful argument to destroy value. And actually, Harari cites Bloom as one of his sources. This is before Howard and I met. And Howard kind of expresses the classical argument against value. And I've referred to it earlier in the week, but I want to just kind of, with permission, say it again now a little more slowly, which is, he says, so you say, now let's take this really slow. You say not me, you say, right, the great religions say, right, those people say, they say value's real. The great traditions say value's real. Okay. So value's real, that means that it's eternal, because real is the realm of being. It's eternal, it's unchanging. And everybody fucking knows that value is not eternal and unchanging. So Mutzi sent me a book, this is true, I'm not making this up, he can confirm it, called The Global Revolt, 2 years ago, right? He told me about a book, so I got that book, right? And that writer's a classical, uncontaminated material. It's a classical writer, right? And he says, basically, we desperately need liberal values. The liberal world order is really important. He's a great reporter. He's a great storyteller also. He says, but basically, and here's his quote, but everybody knows, he just says that everybody knows, it's a given, that there are no preordained eternal values. They're just ridiculous. We all know that's not true, right? And then the last chapter of his book is called The New Story, and his new story is about basically what I would call infrastructure moves. What can you change in the infrastructure to make it better? But his assumption is, and he's a beautiful young man, a colleague of my daughter's actually, right, in Israel, right? He basically says, you can't talk about intrinsic value. It's just a given that that's not true. That's where Obama's coming from. It's just a given that's not true. Why? And so there's Howard's argument in his book, The Lucifer Principle, but Howard's representative of, 50 other books, 100 other books you could quote. Howard basically says, hey, and again, we've alluded to this already earlier in the week. So if it's familiar, fantastic, okay? Right, he says, well, you say love is eternal and love is a value. Let's take Eros, which we're making our major value. Okay, fantastic. So what did love mean 2,000 years ago? So 2,000 years ago, right, just a simple example, right, if I was a Chinese patriarch, right, an example I give often, right, and my wife disobeyed me, right, she deserves maybe to have her hands chopped off. But I am a loving husband. So I just beat her. Because I'm a great lover. When someone does that today, we arrest them and appropriately send them to prison. As we should. Because that's not the way you love. But that's what they said love was. And they're both using the word love. So love is obviously a ridiculous word. It doesn't really mean anything. You're just calling it love. But actually there's no substance, there's no value that moves across. That's the core That's the very core, right, of kind of modernity and postmodernity's argument. It starts with David Hume. Now, stay close for a second. It gets really interesting. Okay, it gets really, and it's insanely beautiful, but it's subtle. So, all of modernity, which is rebelling against the, against Aquinas and Maimonides and Avicenna, right, and Averroes, right? In other words, the great scholastic tradition of knowledge. The way they understand value is as being an expression of eternal being. Meaning eternal being is a being with no needs, with no desires, that never changes. So the value that comes out of a world of eternal being, if it's real, if it's really value, must be eternal and unchanging. But if we see this thing called love is changing all the time, well, then it can't be value, because that's not how value works. Value is an expression of the intrinsic nature of the eternal, unchanging being cosmos, as expressed by Buddhism, Hebraicism, right, Christianity, Islam, etc. But actually, we noticed earlier this week that that's not quite how cosmos works. That actually infinity has desires. Infinity desires finitude. Infinity is not only being, infinity is also becoming. Right? There's a way, there's a depth of being, and if you will, there's a wave of becoming. In other words, infinity, now these sentences begin to make sense. They're not just cute sentences. Infinity is not merely a fact, infinity is a story. That's what we mean when we say reality is not merely a fact, reality is a story. Reality, the real, is not just a fact, an eternal being fact. Reality is a story. A story has telos. A story has desire. What does the story desire? Value, but it wants more and more value. That's the plot line, remember? We just talked to a couple of seconds ago. That's the plot line of Cosmos. More and more value. More and more meaning. And so love is eternal. And love evolves. There's a Tao. The Tao is the word they use in Taoism for what I would call the field of value. There's a field of value, but that field of value is both being and becoming. The field of value is evolving. So there's something called Eros, right? And Eros evolves. There's an evolution of love. There's an evolution of Eros, and actually, from the 12th century in England, right, till the 20th century in England, there's an evolution of love. We've moved from egocentric love to ethnocentric love, to world-centric love, to cosmocentric love at the leading edges of consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean love doesn't mean anything. Love always means caring for, right? Caring for, right? Protecting, nurturing. But what caring for, protecting, nurturing means evolves, right? And clarifies. And it gets deeper. And it gets wider. So in other words, reality desires, and reality desires more value. Right? So here's the sentence. The eternal Tao is the evolving Tao. There's no split between those two. Right? Right? I said this to my friend, Professor Art Green, who's kind of the, premier scholar of, certain kind of mysticism in the world. And he said, we can't go back to perennialism. That's what we need, but no one's going to go there because of value. I said, no, Art, it's an evolving perennialism. And he just stopped. He said, that's a contradiction, isn't it? Then he thought about it again, and in an instant he got it. He said, he just got it. Oh, it's an evolving perennialism. Isn't that wild? The perennialists were confused. The perennialist Aldous Huxley, summarizing perennial philosophy, included, they said perennial truths are eternal, unchanging truths, which is why perennialism got rejected. Because it's not just eternal, unchanging truth, it's evolving truth. So if you actually root perennialism in a denial of evolution, you're fucked. That's postmodernity's point. That's what postmodernity is saying. Right? Really? You're going to go back to perennialism? Fuck off. Right? There's something called evolution, buddy. Right? Like, let's not even have that conversation. Which is why the entire New Age bypass doesn't work. It's why the New Age has succeeded in not changing the world so well. Because actually, the serious thought in the world says, what are you guys doing? You're making a regressive move back to pre-modernity and calling it mythic, magic, shamanic? Nicely done. I'm glad you had a good experience and you drummed well, right? Which is great. And by the way, I love mythic, magic, shamanic, and drumming too, right? That's great. But that's not going to resource the source code unless you weave that together. It's not that you leave that. You don't leave that out. I want to be clear. You don't leave that out. You want to drum. You want mythic, magic, shamanic, but it's got to be part of the larger story, right? So in the story, in a story that's more intimate, there's a great sense. In an intimate story, you include every piece of the story. So you don't leave out shamanic. You don't leave out drumming. You don't leave out magic. You don't leave out mythic. That's all in the story, but it's part of an evolving story because to be more intimate is to be intimate with all the chapters of the story. So for example, in your own story, if you rip out pages in your own book of life, you become non-intimate with yourself. So if we rip out epics in world history, we become non-intimate with reality. Reality is a story. It's an evolving story, and all the stages of the story have value. And we need to integrate the value from all the stages into this new story. So there is a Tao, but the Tao is evolving, okay? So the eternal Tao is the evolving Tao. Now, if you can't say that, right, you can't create value in the world. So, for example, techno-feudalism assumes that value is not real. So, for example, the value of personhood, of irreducible uniqueness, of attention, as something that I have a right to my own attention, right? All of those are assumed by the techplex to be not real. Assumed to be not real. So you develop a techplex that speaks to the lowest common denominator. And when Shoshana Zuboff writes Surveillance Capitalism to critique the techplex, Shoshana can't quite find the ground from which to launch the critique, which she says needs to, I'm quoting her, right, arouse astonishment and outrage. Because you only arouse astonishment and outrage when there's been a violation of value. But if value is not real, then there's no astonishment and outrage, then there's no political will. And there's no political will, you can't actually create transformation. So value is real. Okay, that's the big, value is real, and value is evolving. And there's no contradiction between those two, right? And the reason that the classical modern thinkers couldn't envision this is because they all viewed reality as eternal being. So if you want to figure out why is there an anti-sexual bias, right, in most of the great traditions, because sexuality is not about being, it's about becoming. Sexuality is not spacious bliss being, right, although it has a dimension of that on a good day, right, but it's also about ecstatic urgency. It's about movement. It's about change. It's about transformation. Evolution is a series of transformations. The cosmos is a sexual cosmos. It's an amorous cosmos, right? And so if you basically view reality as eternal, unchanging being, and value, therefore, is an expression of that eternity, and then you see that values change all the time, then you say, well, that's not an expression of the real. And so the real itself must be an illusion. So value is actually just created. It's just a social construction of reality. It's just a story. It's just a fiction. But it's not, actually, right? Story itself is a first principle and first structure of cosmos. You get how dramatic that is? Story itself is the first principle and first value of cosmos. And what does a story do by its very nature? It evolves. A story has a vector. A story has, Jane says, a plot line, right? And the same plot line matters, if you will, all the way up and all the way down. It's the desire for more and more value. Let me say it just one final different way. I'll say it in the most dramatic way you can say it. There's more God to come. But that's really, it's the essence of the whole thing. There's more God to come. That's the realization of infinity desiring finitude. And I'll say it this way. Here's an equation. Infinity plus finitude equals more infinity. That's the point. That's the point. I mean, it's shocking. It's fucking shocking. And it's the essential realization that actually lives inside of us. That's the realization that lives inside of us, right? And Schelling, in his later writings, which I was not aware of till about 2 months ago, when a young intern, right, who started working with us from Cambridge, right, read all the stuff that he could find in CosmoErotic Humanism, and he's doing his thesis on Cambridge on the later writings of Schelling that Ken hadn't seen, and I hadn't seen. He actually saw in the later writings of Schelling, Schelling's got a sense of this. And he was ecstatic about it. And I'd never met him. He told me he's been reading Radical Kabbalah the last 5 years as his yearly ritual. This young, British kid, beautiful young man, right? So it's like, wow, right? It's like, wow. So I haven't even had a chance to check the references. They're in kind of later on published stuff, right? But it's gorgeous, right? And there's more God to come, right? Infinity, right? And I can't vouch for Schelling because it's not in the published stuff, and I haven't looked at the later stuff, and if it's there, we'll add it to the footnotes. But get the equation. Infinity plus finitude equals more infinity. In other words, there's more God to come. And Homo Amor is more God to come. That's what Homo Amor is. It's like, fuck me, right? Right. And we'll take questions. We're going to spend like 1 more minute. We'll open for questions. But I just want to just get the last piece, then we'll open. Okay. Okay. Just last piece, right? So just say it last time. Infinity plus finitude equals more infinity. Because infinity desires finitude, but finitude really is more of itself. That's what we said yesterday. Infinity experiences a shocking self-recognition when looking in your face. That's what it means to be a human being. That's what it means to be Homo Amor, is the realization that I'm the incarnation of more God to come. We call that apotheosis. Apotheosis. And apotheosis is Metatron. It's the human being who became God. But it's not the cheap grace of the New Age bypass, where people say, hey, I am God, or whatever, go to sleep. Right? No. It's so subtle. It's so deep. And it's so beautiful. And it's so true. Apotheosis. Right? That's the great story. The great story is the human being becomes God. That's the plot line of the story. That's the story. Well, that's a big story. That's a big story. Right? Infinity plus finitude equals more infinity. There's more God to come. The plot line is apotheosis. The human being becomes God. That's the plot line of the story. Right? And mystery is always there. And there's uncertainty and 1,000 things we don't understand. And there's dark matter, and interiors and dark matter and exteriors all over the place. But we can discern the plot line because it lives in us. That's why we can find it. It's actually, we recognize it. Oh, my life matters. And the perpetuation of my uniqueness matters. And I've got a verse to write. And I'm irreducibly unique, and my story matters. And it's not just a function of my pathology. Right? And there's a new coming together, and there's a new way to be human. And there's a new possibility, because the real is the possibility of possibility. So we're at that moment where there's a crisis. The crisis is a birth. It's an evolutionary driver. It's the crisis of intimacy. It births a global intimacy disorder. And the only response to it, which allows us to respond and transform existential and catastrophic risk, is a new order of intimacy. Here's the last sentence, which is a new order of intimacy with ourselves. To realize I'm a man God. I'm a woman God. And not to realize that is to be non-intimate with my own nature. So for those of you who thought, why is he repeating that again? That's why I was repeating it. because it adds an entirely new dimension. In other words, genuine intimacy is shared identity with the divine. In the context of otherness, right? Because there's still KK, there's still Rob, there's still Steph, there's still Yvonne, right? There's still Walter, there's still Eveline, there's still Krista, there's still Jane. So intimacy is apotheosis. Intimacy is shared identity with the divine in the context of otherness. I'm a human being. But we actually have mutuality of recognition. We recognize each other. We feel each other. Mutuality of pathos. We're living in the same field of value, which is why Abraham can challenge God and say, God, you're not doing it right. Because we're in the same field of value. Right? And mutuality of purpose. We're aligned with the real. Okay, let's just breathe for a second.